So make sure you get a nice large breakfast, and we're going to get started a little bit early and we're going to end a little early. Generally speaking, knowing this crowd, that's never goes over poorly. So we have a number of time commitments up here that I know Delegate Bell has to be in Goochland at 10 o'clock. So he's going to drive the speed limit. So he'll be leaving promptly at 9, but I wanted to make certain if you want more coffee, anything else, the back door will be open. Please feel free to use it. I think I know everyone in here, but I feel like I need to say I'm Neil Williamson. I serve as the president of the Free Enterprise Forum. And as hard as it is for me to believe, I am also entering my 20th year serving as CAAR's Government Affairs Director. Thank you. Now, many people think of December and they think about breakfast with Santa Claus. Not me. I dream of a legislative breakfast. Unfortunately, S. Lisa is on her way, I believe, and she may be joining us late, but I wanted to make certain that I highlighted some of the things that I know she wanted to say to you guys today, and the idea that advocacy does not stop at the ballot box. Working with our colleagues at Virginia Realtors, we impact General Assembly legislation every day. Advocacy takes many forms. We make our voices heard through individual investments in the Realtor Political Action Committee, or RPAC. Happy to report, we have over 54% of our membership supporting RPAC in 2022. We had 562 CAAR investor members, 33 major investors, 2 President's Circles, 3 Hall of Fame, and a partridge in a pear tree. We raised nearly $90,000 this year. For the 8th year, CAAR has garnered the National Association of Realtors RPAC Triple Crown for our performance. Many thanks to CAAR's RPAC Chair, Kim Armstrong, and Vice Chair, Tammy Wilk. We're fortunate to have much of our legislative delegation with us. Our seasoned legislators, sorry guys, come from a variety of backgrounds to provide a welcome balance of wisdom and focused energy, as well as new ideas. I'd like to introduce and welcome our representatives to CAAR this morning. State Senator Creigh represents the 25th District, which includes Allegheny, Bath, Highland, Nelson, and Rockbridge County, as well as part of Albemarle County. Creigh has served in the State Senate since 2001. He served in the House of Delegates from 92 until 2001. Welcome, Creigh. Delegate Rob Bell is in his 10th term representing the 58th District. The 58th District includes parts of Albemarle, Fluvanna, Greene, and Rockingham counties. Welcome, Rob. 57th District Delegate Sally Hudson is here. Her district includes the city of Charlottesville as well as a portion of Albemarle County. Welcome, Sally. The 25th District, which includes Augusta County, Rockingham, and portions of western Albemarle, also features second-term delegate Chris Runion. Okay, then there's a bunch of stuff about me. We don't need that. Yeah, sorry. We make this up as we go. I want to take this moment to thank the folks here at Hillsdale Conference Center, and specifically Brent Woodyard, who did a great job with the logistics of this event. Thank you, Brent. In my role as the public affairs director here, I work with CAAR Public Affairs Group, the volunteer leadership, as well as our good friends at Virginia Realtors on the annual legislative agenda. I don't have to tell this group, 2023 is an election year. But first, we have a legislative session to deal with. Our questions today will remain focused on the upcoming legislative session. Trust me, we are going to have plenty of time to talk about the election. Today, we have 4 of our state legislators with us. If you have a question for the legislators, please write them down and hold it up, and someone from CAAR will bring it up to me, to Ashley and I, and we'll get going on that. For those that are veterans, at this point, much of the legislation concepts have been submitted to this machine that I call LIS. they're concepts only. And when they come out of LAS, they kind of look different sometimes. The sponsors, for the legislation I'm going to talk about, Virginia Realtors has sponsors, but they haven't identified all the co-sponsors yet. So rather than do anything and upset anyone, we're just not going to mention who's bringing forth this legislation at this time. That'll come out in about 3 weeks. As most of you in this room know, legislation is an iterative process. And so when we get it out of LAS, it looks like something. When it leaves the House of Delegates, it might look like something else. When it leaves the Senate, it may look like a third thing. And by the time the governor signs it, there could be a conference committee that makes it look even like a fourth thing. So it is something that is a marathon, not a sprint. Now this year, the Virginia Realtors have 4 big issues that they are pushing forward proactively. I'm going to run through those very quickly. One is the Resale Disclosure Act. This is a big deal. For years, we've worked kind of around the edges with the POA and the COA and cooperative property law. This bill runs 70 pages. Most of it's just references to other parts of the code. It consolidates within one chapter, a Resale Disclosure Act. The act uses one term, and I still have to get used to using this term, the resale certificate, or the packet of disclosures required to go from the seller to the buyer when a property is in a common interest community. The act also sets forth requirements for contract disclosures, formatting, and the contents of the resale certificate, applicable fees, termination rights, and liability. Substantive changes also include the process for calculating fees and when fees are paid. What this is going to result in is a single document cover sheet that says all the stuff that's in the resale certificate and where you find it. So you're looking for the HOA regs. It's going to be page 57 in this particular packet, but it's all right there. So you've got your checklist of things to get done, and it makes it a lot simpler. We also have a security deposit bill coming forward. What we found in recent times with labor shortages, as well as the supply chain issues, if a property owner has to provide an itemized accounting of damages that exceed the security deposit within 15 days of vacating, that's proved challenging for some of our property owners. This bill would allow 30 days, up to 30 days for that accounting, only of those things that exceed the security deposit. The third bill is the CIC Ombudsman bill. We have to take a little blame on this. See, a few years back, Virginia Realtors brought this forward, and it was a great idea. And it was brought forward by a delegate, Terry Suit. You guys may know her. And anyway, we found in practice we need some more accountability. And so that's what this bill does. It draws up accountability regarding the number of annual reporting of association compliance and the number of violations that are referred. Okay, those are the 3 what I consider kind of technical bills. Now there's one good one. The others are good, don't get me wrong. This August, CAAR held a property rights luncheon talking about short-term rentals. There is a bill that's being formulated now that Virginia Realtors is working with several legislators on that would discuss many of the local issues. When we would go and talk to legislators, they'd say, yeah, your guys aren't the problem. It's all these other yahoos that are running the Wild West of short-term rental. So this session, Virginia Realtors are supporting a bill that would make certain categories of local ordinances unenforceable against properties that are managed by a Virginia Realtor. Though in the initial draft, those areas are no blanket prohibition of short-term rental, no limits on occupancy beyond building code, no limits on days rented annually, no remote monitoring of the property, no requirement for repairs beyond building code, no inspections greater than 5 years, no additional parking requirements, and realtors will have to be a part of an STR registry if the locality has it. This is a big deal. And as you guys know, I sit in a lot of local meetings, and localities are going to hate this. But it is probably the best crafted legislation I've seen, because I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all short-term rental that can be done at the state level. This provides a carve out for realtor managed properties, because when you're a realtor managed property, you have a higher code of ethics. You are in the neighborhood, you have contact information, and you have a reputation to uphold. Well, this is in drafting now. Stay tuned. As CAAR members know, advocacy for property rights is a marathon, not a sprint. And as such, you must recognize many of our battles, not based on VR's legislative agenda, but protecting property rights against others' agendas. The key points in these defensive battles are open discussions with policymakers. These discussions are built on our years of relationship with legislators like we have up here today. We are lucky to have the Virginia Realtors legislative team working the halls in Richmond for us. For those looking ahead, CAAR will be hosting a day on the Hill on January 31st. Attendance will be limited. We'll meet with our legislators and or their staff to discuss the legislative agenda. We'll have lunch with the VR staff, hear what they're hearing. I encourage you to sign up on the portal in the next 2 weeks when it's live and active. It will be limited because we have limited space available within the General Assembly, Pocahontas building, also known as the Taj Mahal, and also at VR. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the meeting over to our legislators, who each will provide 3 to 5 minute introduction and talk about their thoughts on the Virginia legislative agenda, a statement of their legislative priorities, and the 2023 session. And then we're going to get to some questions. I want to let you know that, as I mentioned, Rob has to leave relatively quickly, so I'm going to have him go first. And it's no slight to us, but I appreciate Rob making the time. So if I could, Delegate Bell.
Live. All right. Good morning, everybody. So I think everybody knows, or many of you know, I'm the chairman of the esteemed Courts of Justice Committee. It's been around 295 years, following the footsteps of Patrick Henry, who was chair, James Madison, who was chair. What that means for a part-time legislator is today I have a speeding ticket I have to do down in Goochland. And the only day the officer was available was this Monday. Case starts at 10:30. I've got to leave literally in 5 minutes, and I apologize for leaving early. In terms of your agenda, I want to talk real briefly about things I'll be working on, but just so I don't lose track. The issue about the Airbnbs, as everybody's calling, and I know there's other verbos and the rest, is I think an interesting one for you all and for us as legislators. And I was sharing that I recently had a personal, it hasn't been personal to me, it's always been constituents bringing concerns on both sides. And I live in Briarwood, which I think most of you surely know is just it's a sort of middle-class subdivision. It's actually split into 3 HOAs just by the way it got built. And was walking the dog, recall it was, I think, Saturday morning early, and there was some neighbors having a loud dispute in the front yard. And it was puzzling because they all looked to be in their young 20s. Now, you know, Briarwood, it's a very much a family subdivision. It's in the Baker Butler catch. So we get a lot of families getting started, a lot of inject. We don't often have 5 or 6 cars in front of one of our little houses with 6 young people in their 20s having some kind of shouting match in the front yard. And when I went back, I was puzzled and actually thought to myself, I wonder, looked it up, and yeah, not surprisingly, that is the only Airbnb-able property in all of Briarwood. And if anyone thinks that this is not that granular, meaning the experiences people are having are not driving what their experiences are, the neighbor to that neighbor, I'm sure, is unhappy that their neighbor is now having this kind of thing happen. I have no idea what happened. I didn't intervene, but I do think that's going to be the backdrop to some of these bills as they go through, is that much like with zoning issues, the neighbors bought, or the homeowners bought the house with expectations of what the neighborhood would be like. Why do they care what's happening in their neighbor's house? Because it affects directly their house, their property values, and things like that. And in the biggest picture, we're seeing up in Arlington, they're talking, I guess it's upzoning. Is that what the term is? And you're going to have many of the same issues arise, which would be, I bought this property, you all sold me this property with an expectation of what it would be like for the next 20 years, and it's not. Something is changing out from under me. So I think that's driving the very sort of hot personal nature of these debates we're going to see down in Richmond. Creigh, I'm sure we'll talk about this some in terms of issues that are not necessarily realtor issues, but that we'll be working on. I serve on the Crime Commission. I am the chairman of the committee. That's the Criminal Laws Committee. So I think you're going to hear us try to address issues that have arisen over the last year. There's been several. We're seeing a spike in retail theft. And you might have seen some of the images on TV. And we're trying to see, is there a way that there was a change made in the law 2 years ago? I don't think that there's a stomach to roll that all back, but maybe find some way to find some common ground where you have people stealing over and over big quantities from some of our retail establishments. Second, we have an issue as marijuana has moved toward legalization, a concern about what they call DUID driving, driving under the influence of drugs. And as people are either switching from alcohol to marijuana or adding marijuana to the alcohol, we're finding it harder and harder to prosecute. There's no breath test for it. And so the training the officers got at the academy where they pull you over, they do a couple of field sobriety tests, and then if you seem to be under the influence, they can give you a little bitty field breath test. Almost all the patrol cars have it. We don't have any of that. So that's the first thing. It's harder to even identify. And then just in terms of, I think everybody understands 0.08 alcohol means you have a DUI. We don't have an equivalent test for marijuana. So each case is being sort of tried on its own, just like it's the 1950s with alcohol, where the officer kind of comes in and has to describe it. Those are some of the challenges we're likely to try to address on the criminal side. And then on the mental health side, I think everyone understands we have a ongoing bed shortage, and it was exacerbated but not caused by COVID, but now it's worse. And so right now, if you have a loved one who says, I am experiencing a crisis, or even worse, the police pick them up and try to take them to the hospital, there's not always a bed available. And you have people waiting in emergency rooms for days. Worse, sometimes the emergency room just doesn't find them. And Creigh and I are on we'll call it the Deeds Commission, but where we have been exploring this and have discovered that more than 100 people over the last year were ordered into care, brought to the ER, and just walked out the door. And so no one knows what happened to them. We hope that they either got mental health care through another avenue or were brought back later. But every single one of those is a potential disaster. And we had one down in Farmville who actually reached me on my cell phone in a panic. Her son had that happen. He was barricaded in a motel with SWAT teams there. And so we got to stop. I mean, it's hard to visualize a good outcome there, but it's very easy to visualize a bad one. So with that, I'm going to sneak out the side door. You have great lobbyist is a word that people get a bad name. All it means is someone who lobbies. Your people in Richmond are very diligent. And of course, I get to see most of you when you come to the visit day. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob, and drive safe. Continuing on alphabetically, the aforementioned Senator Deeds.
Well, thanks very much. The story Rob told you about going to Goochland is just to point out that this work is not that glamorous. You know, Rob and I are both lawyers, and I'm co-chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is the kind of the cognate of the House of Delegates Courts of Justice Committee. Well, in August, I show up at the Charlottesville General District Court representing a client on a drunken public. Lo and behold, Rob's got the co-defendant. So the chairs of the committees that have to do with the judges and the making the law had to appear in Charlottesville General District Court on basically the same case. And I promise you those kinds of cases don't pay a whole lot. But I want to apologize first off, because last week I got notified by the Virginia Employment Commission that I've got a 10 o'clock hearing doing telephonically. And I'm going to use one of your office space. But I'll cut out of here about 5 minutes to 10 because I'm going to have to take care of a client. One thing in Profiles in Courage, which is a book that John F. Kennedy is credited with writing, a line that appears on the wall of his library in Massachusetts, kind of connects with what Neil was talking about earlier. It describes, I think, perfectly the relationship between people and the Republic. We, the people, are the boss. And we get the kind of political leadership, be it good or bad, that we demand and deserve. And I pause there for a second because nobody really thinks they deserve the bad leadership. But if they don't stay engaged all the time, sometimes that's what you end up with. You have to stay engaged. You have to stay, and in Virginia, we have elections every single year, so you can't afford not to be engaged. This legislative session is a short session, 46-day session. There's some talk that it'll be even shorter because the Constitution says that it's a 30-day session, but it can be extended by a 2/3 vote to make it a 46-day or 45-day session. And historically, it's almost always been extended. There's some talk this year, 2 years ago, the Republicans in the Senate basically refused to go forward with the 46-day session kind of in response to the long session, special session Democrats did in 2020 on criminal justice, the session that never seemed to end. So there's some talk that somebody in the House of Delegates will do that this session. Well, it's not a good idea. We have real work to do. You know, I think that anybody would be foolish to think that the shooting that occurred here and the shooting that occurred in Chesapeake aren't going to influence to a large extent what happens this session. We'd be very insensitive not to try to understand the trauma that this whole community and certainly everybody at UVA experience. And to look, I had a conversation on Saturday morning with the governor, and I know there are going to be some big proposals on mental health, but I think we have to go beyond that. We have to figure out how we deal with this, with the supply of weapons that are on the street. And so there will be lots of debate around that issue. With respect to the mental health work, you know, that we've been involved in for a number of years, we made a lot of progress, but we saw a lot of the progress erode during the pandemic. The increased demand on the hospitals, the demand for mental health services across the board. We've got real problems there. We have to, and so my focus won't really change from the issues that involve the committees I'm on: judiciary, privileges and elections, rules, capital. You know, I chair the capital outlay subcommittee, commerce and labor. I will be involved in a lot of stuff, but on mental health, we're going to be focused primarily on a couple of things: on rebuilding our workforce. That's going to require an investment of money. And then on these crisis stabilization units or crisis response centers that the governor's calling them, which frankly, if they're funded properly and if they're staffed properly, they can take a tremendous amount of pressure off our police departments, off our emergency rooms, off our hospitals, and they get people services they need. So at the end of the day, you know, this session is going to be about what every session's about. It's going to be about priorities. You know, we're going to draft amendments to the 2-year budget, and the budget is ultimately a statement of priorities. The governor, you know, we'll work with him where we agree, and that's on mental health, just to a large extent. We will disagree on some things. You know, he's proposing a taxpayer protection fund, and that's so far undefined. We'll get some definition this week, I hope, but we've got to figure out how we do all that and properly fund K through 12 education, because when we don't properly fund K through 12 education, we put tremendous pressure on local governments, much less denying opportunities to kids. So we have a whole lot on our plate this session, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Next up, Delegate Hudson.
Thank you so much for having us. I look forward to this breakfast every year because I think realtors are such fantastic partners to legislators, because you have your fingers on the pulse of the community. Whatever is missing, whether it's adequate housing or room in overcrowded classrooms or doctors nearby who have room for patients, you all hear it first. And when you talk to us about what you're hearing, not only just about the nitty-gritty of your profession, but you are great ears out in the community and everything that you do. So I appreciate everything that you do to funnel those insights to us as just great people that are engaged in our community more broadly. I also have my excuse for why I have to duck out early, and I think it's relevant to my legislative priorities. I have a doctor's appointment over at UVA Health that I scheduled back in August, and when I called to see if I could reschedule it, when I found out this breakfast was coming up, the next opening was in May. And that is my segue to, we have a healthcare workforce shortage. And it's at absolutely every age and stage in life. If you have little ones, their pediatricians are stretched to the max right now. And it's not just COVID, it's not just RSV, it is everything else that is circulating in our elementary schools and wiping out teachers and teaching assistants alike. It runs all the way up to our nursing homes and our assisted living facilities, which are still stretched to the max. If you talk to our assisted living facility managers, in many ways, their workforce shortage is now worse than it was in 2020, because they have just exhausted what was the end of the slack. I'm a member of the health committee in the House. I do workforce development in my day job. And so that's the work that is top of mind for me going into this session. I'm really excited about some of the partnerships that we have brewing between the Hospital Association and the community colleges and everyone in between about trying to ease the pipeline for workforce development into healthcare professions. In particular, making it easier for people to get on the track toward building those career skills while they're earning money. Virginia has a pretty underdeveloped apprenticeship program relative to other states, even places like North Carolina, South Carolina, who we'd like to think of as our peers. They do a better job getting folks' foot in the door, letting them build their skills and then get on the track toward what is an incredibly personally and financially rewarding career if you get on that track. So that's going to be one of my top priorities. Because we are going into a shorter session, as Senator Deeds described, and because we have partisan division in Richmond, I'm trying to prioritize the stuff that I think might move in that environment. I am really heartened by the work that the governor has done with his listening sessions on affordable housing in every corner of Virginia, recognizing that that looks different in Arlington and Richmond than it does in Wise County, but there's a flavor of it everywhere. And so I'm working on a handful of bipartisan bills related to short-term rentals, related to accessory dwelling units, similar to the STR bill you described, trying to set some minimum standards for making it easier for those units to be on the market. I'm also very interested in the intersection between housing and healthcare, because right now Virginia's Medicaid program doesn't allow you to use your healthcare coverage to pay for housing expenses. And for a lot of people who are coming out of hospitalization, covering their rent is the most important expense they have for being able to stabilize the rest of their recovery. So I'm working on a budget amendment to help Virginia start piloting a housing for healthcare program here. And then I think last of the places where I'm most optimistic about some good bipartisan compromise in the upcoming session is on energy and innovation. One of the things I appreciate about this governor, as someone who is a bit of an outsider to the Richmond system, is that he is not as cozy with the utilities as Richmond politicians have typically been, and has been more willing to loosen some of the red tape on competition in the clean energy industry. Whether that means putting more solar panels on your roofs, or giving some of the clean energy companies that are based right here in Charlottesville more even footing to compete with the big boy utilities who have always had first crack at those contracts. So those are some places in healthcare, in housing, and in energy where I am, at least at this point in December, cautiously optimistic about some good collaboration and compromise in the upcoming session.
Well, we always love cautious optimism going into session. Next up, Delegate Runion.
Good morning. You know, it's a delight to see you all. I enjoy coming across. Now, the sun was a little bright this morning coming across Afton, but there's a couple of things that I wanted to chat with you all about. One is it's an amazing amount of traffic that moves from west to east during the commute times across 64. And I'm old, and I grew up in the valley. I'm old enough to remember when, you know, you could have skated down the mountain and not run into anybody, right? And that's not true now. And we had a conversation a little bit earlier about some housing affordability. You know, my perception is we have forced an awful lot of folks, workforce housing has moved to the west side of the mountain. And that's created opportunities for folks over there. It's created some challenges, perhaps for both communities with transportation issues and like that. And I think that's an area that we've got to have those conversations on. That's a specific area. But I wanted to comment on something that Delegate Hudson and Senator Deeds both said. I am also cautiously optimistic that there'll be a sense of collaboration and communication and really achieve what's important for the citizens of the Commonwealth. We may come at those issues from different points of view, and I think that's great, because I doubt that there's any one of you all in here that have 100% agreement with the person you're sitting beside. And what I think is important is that we all of us are sitting here trying to work with you all to make our lives, or our citizens of the Commonwealth's lives, better, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's transportation, whether it's energy, whether it's law enforcement issues. Everybody wants to make positive step and step forward. And it's a matter of having those conversations so we can achieve those things without compromising your values. Recognizing that we are a short session and it may be shorter than has ever happened. I think, is that right, Senator? We've never actually done this stuff in 30 days. Yeah. So it'll be exciting. My wife was excited and my dog was excited to know that I may come home 2 weeks earlier than normal. I'm not anticipating that happening. And I don't think it should, because one of the things that's really important is there needs to be enough time to have conversation and understanding so that we don't pass bills that have unintended consequences and frankly screw up your lives. And that happens. You know, government has the best of intentions. You all have talked about it with your omnibus bill, right? So, and a couple of things that I'm looking at, and this list is subject to compression depending on what all happens, but some of the things that I am working on, some transportation projects, particularly relating to 81. I'm sorry, I got to put my glasses on. I can't read my writing. Transportation projects, some tax reform. You all may be aware, many of you all, I'm assuming, are independent contractors. And so you share that same challenge that I do, trying to get our tax returns done. And the fact that Virginia does not conform to the federal tax code makes it very difficult and adds cost to our tax preparation bill. Makes our CPAs grumpy in the first quarter. And that's an area that, I'd be honest with you, I think that there ought to be bipartisan agreement on and move forward. I'm not sure there will be, to be frank about it. Let's see. Looking at a couple of different tax credits. One would be for adoption, to encourage folks, actually to offset some of the costs that are out of pocket costs on these folks with adoption. I've spent a lot of time over this last year talking to families that are in the foster care system and going through the adoption process. It's tough. It is really difficult. And you have to admire those folks that will go all through that. The other is GED. I've had a constituent that has thought a whole lot about this, and he's done some studies. GED unemployment, folks that without a high school degree, without a high school or equivalency, unemployment differences is somewhere between 4 right now, and as much as 16% above the state average. And so those folks without a high school degree, we all know how challenging that is for them to work into the workforce. This idea would create a tax credit back to that individual to, if they worked 3 years in the Commonwealth, then they would get an additional amount each of those 3 years. We're trying to work through the process on that. I would hope that would have some bipartisan support. I'm very much supportive of mental health. It is a problem wherever we are in the Commonwealth. I toured Western State 3 or 4 months ago. We have 56 beds, 28 of which have never been used. They're brand new because we don't have enough staff to operate them. And we have 28 more that used to be in service that are not. I think, I assume those numbers are still accurate like that. And so, you know, the first step is rebuilding our workforce. The second step is we've got to be innovative in how we provide those services. I'm really excited about opportunities to create crisis intervention centers. I think those that are in existence in the Commonwealth have performed very well. There is a strong desire in the Shenandoah Valley to create one, and for a regional application, and lots of improvements to our quality of life. Our law enforcement folks are not tied up providing custody of folks in an emergency room. For Augusta Health shared with me, they've had folks up there for a week. Now you can imagine being in a mental health crisis for a week, sitting in an emergency room with a law enforcement person. You're not getting any treatment. Law enforcement's not doing their job. We've got to get those things fixed. And again, I'm optimistic we'll see some bipartisan movement forward on that. Housing. There's going to be some stuff talked about housing, and I appreciate the governor coming forward on that. The challenge I would ask all of us is, how can we figure out how to have truly affordable housing that works within our community? Because to be honest with you, I don't think we're there. I think we're doing things, but I don't think they're particularly effective. And I hear too many young families, young folks that are out of high school, out of college, that are really struggling to find availability. It was in Highland County a couple of weeks ago, and their number 2 product or problem was no rental housing available for workforce, kids moving away from home, all the things that you have in that rental housing market in a rural community, because it's all been sucked up by Airbnb. And, in 2 weekends, you've paid for a month's worth of rental income, and a whole lot easier and going forward. You all understand that problem. I certainly would like to hear from you all ways that you think we could be effective and actually address this affordable housing issue in the era that we're in. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. As this group knows, CAAR is a volunteer-driven organization. And as such, when legislative priorities come up, they move through a master group system. The public affairs group vets the idea and brings it forward to the board of directors. And question 1, which is going to be going to Senator Deeds, has gone through this process, and the board of directors has endorsed a new position for CAAR. While it's not part of the Virginia Realtors legislative agenda, CAAR's Code of Public Policy supports broad-based, multifaceted tax system. CAAR is in support of the effort of several of our localities to have the ability to levy additional sales tax. Prior to last year, 9 localities had requested this ability and 9 were approved. Last year, a bill to allow Charlottesville this same power failed in committee. Senator Deeds, to you first. What are your thoughts on the local sales tax?
Sure. I'll have a bill this time that will allow Charlottesville and Albemarle to raise their sales tax. And I will sit down with and court very hard the chairman of the committee in the House that blocked this last time. One of the localities that she represents, or that is just below the area she represents, Pittsylvania County, was the only county that previously had turned down the sales tax referenda, but they approved it this year. I want to give her a chance to tell me what solutions are out there to solve this $30 billion problem we've got of school construction throughout Virginia. If she's not willing to give local taxpayers the ability to say, raise our taxes to build schools or not. I mean, it's still going to require a referendum. So I intend to take a 2-faceted approach. I'll have a bill that will allow Charlottesville and Albemarle to conduct the referenda, and I'm also going to stick it in the budget. So if she won't go along with the bill, maybe I can get something in the budget that she won't have a yes or no vote on. We'll see.
All right, next up is Delegate Hudson. I know you have opinions on this.
Senator Deeds and I carried the legislation that would have authorized our community and other communities statewide to levy these sales taxes. It died in a subcommittee in the House that Delegate Runion and I both serve on. I voted for it and he voted against it. And so I think I'm more eager to hear his thoughts on why he voted against the bill, which would have authorized funding for school construction in the city and the county where all of these good people come from.
Delegate Runion, it's up to you.
I appreciate that. So was anticipating this question, and I find it really fascinating. Fundamentally, I always am challenged of why we always have government that's asking for more as opposed to figuring out how to do with less and how to be more efficient and effective in their utilization of their funds. So one of the things that really was a negative for me is when the city of Charlottesville came to me and said, we would like you to support this bill. I told them I would not. And they said, you recognize that we can't afford to buy a fire truck if we don't get this. Now, what that told me was that you're so physically stressed in the city that $1 million fire truck pushes you over the edge. I thought that was an irrational argument for doing this. Okay. Again, and I had this conversation with a higher education, a university recently. They were coming with their handout saying, we need these more things to do these more things for our students. And I said, I understand, but how come you've never come to me and said, we figured out how to be more effective and efficient in providing this service? You all don't operate the realtor world like you did 30 years ago. And so you're efficient, you're effective, or you wouldn't be here. And that's the challenge for me. If we allow localities to have unfettered abilities to raise their taxes, then you're going to create some disruptions and dislocations that I think are unfair to the citizens. The other thing on school construction in particular, a 1% sales tax does nothing to address most of those localities that cannot afford to build schools or remodel their schools. They just don't have the tax base to do it. And the reality is that Virginia needs the state, and part of me needs to step back and say, why do we have this longstanding issue or tradition of the state not supporting local school systems on their capital construction costs? I personally feel like we have an obligation to do that. I have not figured out why it went in the direction it went, and apparently it's generations of issues. But when you travel in some of the more rural areas and you see the lack of ability, I'm trying to think what Highland County's average income is. $41,000, I think, is their average income. What is it in Albemarle? It's close to 6 figures, isn't it? And so, there's a difference in what a community can afford to do. We all have a desire and a need and an obligation to educate our children throughout the Commonwealth. And so we've got to figure out how to get that capital moved in the places that we actually need it. So other than that.
All right. The one thing to bring forward, one of the benefits to standing up here on the podium, you get to make the rules. So we're going to allow Senator Deeds to have a quick rebuttal there.
I didn't say much on my end.
And quickly move through to talk to Delegate Hudson.
And the whole process is, we have to be able to agree to disagree sometimes and have civil disagreement. And where Chris is right is there's some localities in the state that don't have the tax base. They can't. One penny would not mean a difference, like in Highland County or Cumberland County or even Creigh County, Bland County. There are places where it wouldn't make a difference. There's a retail base here. There's no retail base in Halifax County. They were the first county to do it, that have the 1 cent, and they're building a new high school with that money now. I was surprised that they were able to generate the revenue. This is about giving localities the ability to decide for themselves.
And I would just add that the proposal was not hasty. There was a year-long bipartisan commission on school construction and modernization that came forward with a package of 12 bills, of which this was only one proposal, recognizing that different communities have different needs for the reason that Delegate Runion identified. Those bills passed the Senate with broad bipartisan support, which the Senate has a better bipartisan culture than the House, and they came to die in the House subcommittee. So it's not as if bipartisan legislators didn't work on this for a very long time to document that, as Senator Deeds said, we have a $25–30 billion hole in school construction. It's going to take a lot of tools, of which this sales tax is only one. And in our community like ours, which has a retail base, it's one of the tools that could be effective, but no one thinks it's a solution to the additional very real problem of funding school construction in communities without such an active retail sector. They need help too.
Great. And allowing the opportunity for a shameless plug. If you want to see what the sales tax data reports, go to freeenterpriseforum.org and you can see the third quarter report, retail report. And off the top of my head, Albemarle County collected $1.99 million more in 1% sales tax this year through the third quarter than it did last. There ends the shameless plug. Question 2 goes first to Delegate Hudson. Despite efforts from previous General Assemblies and the federal government, rural broadband continues to be an issue for our members and our customers. Broadband is fast becoming, if it hasn't already, the first question potential buyers ask beyond schools. What, if anything, should the General Assembly do now regarding the rural broadband propagation?
Great question. And this is exactly what I mean when I say realtors tell us what communities need, because you hear what there's shortages of, and broadband is absolutely that. Not just in places where we knew that construction of broadband hasn't been getting there fast enough, but in some of our residents who had the broadband pulled out from under them in the last year. I don't know if you have encountered those clients who were on the short end of that contract. But the short story is that now with the federal investments and then additional state investments, there's a lot of money in the system. What we need most from the General Assembly is oversight. Did you know that broadband is still not classified as a utility by the State Corporation Commission under the same oversight as our electric and our waterways? And so we have nowhere near the same consumer protections in place to make sure that people do get fair deals, that they get adequate notice if their provider is going to leave, or that they are charged a fair price, which we know has been a problem with utilities in general. So I am working with a colleague of mine from Chesapeake, Delegate Jenkins, to add broadband to the scope of authorities for the State Corporation Commission so that we can start treating it like the utility that it is, because it's not a luxury bonus service. It's absolutely a fundamental part of supporting not just family life and recreational life, but increasingly the workforce that is at home. So I think that that's mostly the General Assembly does not need to throw more money into it on top of all of the federal money. In fact, I think we need to be worried about watching that money spent well, because I now worry that there is a lot of free cash in people's pockets, companies' pockets, and not enough people minding the bank.
Great, thank you. We really want it on Fredericksburg Road in Greene County. Delegate Runion.
Thank you. Couple of things on that. It's interesting because I wrote down oversight. And so Delegate Hudson and I very much agree with that. What her last comment about a lot of money in the system, very much concerned with that. Now, I did follow up. We've got a fairly large project going on in Augusta, Rockingham, up and down the valley, actually, from Augusta north. And that provider has not been able to access any state funds yet because they haven't completed anything yet. So we did have that oversight in there. But I am concerned, we've thrown, it's over $1 billion at this thing, right? And so there's supply chain issues. The one provider told me that they're going to decide which community to address based on that they have enough supply of all the parts they need to finish that part of the project. And so that's an interesting way to have to look at it. I agree that we need to look at where broadband goes in the future. It'd be interesting to hear Delegate Jenkins and Delegate Hudson's argument of why it should become a utility, and if there's folks on the other side being able to listen to that. As an aside, Senator Deeds whispered over here a minute ago, he said, "You're brave for being here." And hey, we all chose to be up here, right? We all were elected by that. And I think one of the critical things is that you have conversations, particularly with people that you don't always agree with. And that I've tried to work hard and do that. I've tried to come over the mountain and have those conversations because it is a different perspective. I would encourage you all, and I would encourage my colleagues here to do the same thing. Get out into those communities that have a different perspective on created by their lives versus the lives that you all have over here. And I think it's an obligation of an elected official to be out and listen and talk and understand, listen to understand, and then you can't compromise your values. And so let's figure out how to move forward on those things. And it's quite interesting. Broadband's a great example of that. I anticipate a fair amount of continued bipartisan conversation and then legislation relating to that, again, to make the citizens of the Commonwealth's lives better. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think when we look, I had an interesting email exchange with my friend John Blair, who's now over in Stanton. And I said, we were talking about the sales tax data. I said, there's a lot of sales tax going from Western Albemarle over the mountain. And he says, I'm amazed at how many of my Creigh friends I see at the Friday and Saturday nights events over the mountain. We are one community. There is a mountain. There's sometimes some fog, but we are one community, and we are better when we discuss the differences that we have. Question 3 goes first to you, Delegate Runion. Public safety is an important part of real estate. I don't have to tell you, in rural communities, we have seen an increase in vehicle speeding and crashes. Some localities are requesting the power to utilize speed cameras to enforce speed laws on their roadways that do not allow safe patrolling by police or sheriff. Due to the lack of shoulders and many tight turns, there's nowhere to pull them over. What are your thoughts on speed cameras?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm opposed to speed cameras. And I think you need to go back, to be honest with you, and ask yourself why your roads are different than all your neighbors' roads. Okay? I think you've got an obligation to address that. You know, as I remember reading some history, roads were paved prior to World War II, somewhere starting in the 20s, 30s, and many rural roads were just paved as the wagon road was. And then we spent the last 100 years or so fixing those. Ask yourself if your locality has done what you're supposed to do on that. When this first came up, I looked, and this is information that's a couple years old now. You all in traffic crashes and deaths were in the middle of the pack. You weren't an anomaly over time. And so that would be another reason to ask, what do you really want to expand that? Now, I support it in school zones and work zones, but I don't think that we really want to put a traffic camera, or a speed camera, which I think is truly a Band-Aid on the real problem. The real problem is you've not addressed your infrastructure issues on your local roads. All localities have opportunities to do what they've done. Rockingham said we want 80% of our growth. This was 20, 25, 30 years ago, said we want 80% of our growth on public water and sewer. So by definition, that put them around the 8 or so towns that are in Rockingham and the city of Harrisonburg. We don't have the rural development in the far reaches of Rockingham that other localities do. My friends in Augusta looked at it differently, and it's been amazing as I go out into rural Augusta, the amount of subdivision type properties that are in rural Augusta. They don't have public water, and they don't have they may have public water. Augusta's done a good job with that. They do not have public sewer for the most part. They also struggle to have broadband. They also have struggle on some of their road issues. And so there's decisions that you all make locally that have comprehensive impacts on that. I'm a conservative small government guy, and this may be something that we disagree with, that you may believe that speed cameras solve the problem. I don't. I think you've got a more fundamental problem that you need to address.
Speed cameras work, you know, and some places we have to have them. Here's the reality in response to the infrastructure problem. 1920s, Harry Byrd was governor. Maybe the only thing left from his administration that really counts was he created the Virginia Department of Highways. And that enabled economic development to occur anywhere in the Commonwealth of Virginia, because instead of a non-system dependent on the locality, or a system dependent on the locality, you had a system of highways, system of transportation. The roads that were created roads before the Virginia Department of Highways were created are basically prescriptive easements. Percy Montague has a place up on 678 in Bath County. For the Indian Draft Road, for the most part, that's a Byrd road. That road is the width that it is. You can't get any more unless you condemn the property or buy the property to widen the road. You are stuck with what you have. The problem that we have right now is our localities are changing so much, and transportation has changed so much that we just don't have the deputies to enforce the rules. Now you can build into any speed camera law you have. You can build due process. You can allow the person who's charged to give him or her the opportunity to show up in court and contest the charge. And that's going to be an inconvenience, yes. But I would argue that little bit of inconvenience is worth making the highways a little safer. And particularly in a fast growing community like Albemarle is and has been, you've got to do everything you can to protect people from carnage on the highways.
So I carried the bill that would have allowed localities to put speed cameras on roads with a documented consistent risk of fatalities. That was a project that we developed in last year. I'm gonna bring it back this year. It was a project we developed in collaboration with the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors and the Albemarle County Police Department, because it was the law enforcement officers who were telling us there is no safe place for me to park and conduct speed monitoring. So without cameras, you're basically saying you want there to be a law, but you don't want it enforced. There is no other reliable way to do this on those roads. The frustrating thing to me is that one of the principles that I typically associate with conservatism is small government, allowing local government to have more control than state government. And the last two projects that we've described, both local taxes for the purposes of funding school construction and also local authority to put speed cameras in places with a documented history of safety problems, is a local government issue. And right now it's Richmond that's standing in the way of our community being creative about how to tailor a solution that meets our needs. And so I would think that the principle of limited government, the principle of local government, would argue in favor of allowing local governments to have some flexibility to do this if they've got places where history has shown us we've got people dying on the roads in car accidents. I do think, as Senator Deed said, it's important that those bills have guardrails. If there are concerns, for example, about those cameras being put in some neighborhoods than others, so that you think some people are going to be over monitored and some people are going to get off scot-free, those are the kinds of things that we can work together, I think, to find sensible solutions to. So I think I'm going to listen to law enforcement on this and say we cannot safely enforce this law in some parts of the county, and try to find a creative solution and leverage technology where appropriate to do that.
Thank you. Our first audience question goes to Senator Deeds. And we've talked a little bit about tax credits and tax reform and things. And this kind of ties to Delegate Hudson's comment with regard to healthcare. Has there been any discussion that you've heard from your cohorts regarding tax credits for providing housing to healthcare workers? There is a cohort that I've recently learned about, that traveling nurses that are a great tenant, I'm told, and they have a limited amount of money available, and they are critical to staffing our medical centers. So I was curious if there's any such discussion about such tax credits.
I've not been part of any discussion of that, but JLARC, the Joint Legislative Audit Review Commission, which is kind of the investigative arm of the General Assembly, recently conducted a study of our entire tax system, and they've made a bunch of proposals that would make the tax structure more fair. Over the long haul, I'm on a committee that is going to look at that actually tomorrow. So there could be additional discussion of tax credits. And I agree with you. We've got a healthcare shortage, worker shortage across the board, not just in mental health, but across the board. And we've got, if that sort of tax credit can help us solve the problem, I want to find out as much as I can about it. I will tell you, I was with a family member in the emergency room at UVA within the last year, and the nurse that we worked with was a person that travels, I think, from Russell County, which is pretty far down Southwest Virginia. It's one of the coal counties, travels from Lebanon twice a week to UVA to work different shifts up here. That's exactly the kind of worker that would benefit from something like this. And I would certainly be interested in figuring out ways to make that person's life easier, or incentivize more people with that skill set to be able to provide services.
Delegate Hudson?
So I would love to talk with whoever raised this question, and I hate that I have to duck out early, because I would imagine that the traveling nurse workforce might be great clients for the short-term rental market if it were a little more stable. I will say that I think the UVA health system over the last couple of years has been over-reliant on traveling nurses, and that it has been a symptom of the lack of stability in what should be our permanent nursing workforce. So I do think that there are small things we can do to tinker around the edges to try to make it easier for traveling nurses. But in a community like ours, which is now getting out of what was the peak surprise period of COVID, in terms of healthcare housing, I would rather have us focus on what is the pervasive shortage of housing for everybody in our community, in the career pipeline development of nurses and in making sure that those good healthcare professionals get paid the wages that they need to live here as well. So I'm sure open to the idea of housing tax credits for folks like that. But my sense is that's sort of drop in the bucket of a very bigger problem that might have some deeper solutions.
Delegate Runion?
I appreciate that. I agree with Delegate Hudson. It's a symptom of a very serious issue, and that is supply availability. And it's interesting, Senator Deed's story about this person that comes from Russell to UVA. Russell can't afford to have any of their health professionals leave because they just don't have very many. If you look at, there was a study I read a few years ago that our Southwest and Southside Virginia, we've got healthcare access similar to Mississippi. We don't want that, right? Here in the central part of the valley and the Blue Ridge, we're much better, but our trend isn't good. And so I think there's some bipartisan opportunities to how do we figure out to remove the guardrails, remove the obstacles, remove the friction from having an adequate supply of healthcare professionals. And man, that's from CNAs through, the highest level physician that you can think about. We've got to be willing to look at some innovative ways to do that and address perhaps some of the longstanding sacred cows that restrict healthcare providers from doing the things that need to be done in the modern world. COVID, it's been an interesting exercise in how society can change. How many of us wanted to do telemedicine before COVID? Before COVID, one person, all right. We have a small business and employees, and so we provide health insurance for them. And we tried to promote the telemedicine thing and do all kinds of things. Nobody do it. And since COVID came along, people have been forced into it. And I think I read somewhere about 10% of the services provided now are telehealth, which is up from 2% or something. And so tremendous opportunities because people gave it a chance. And I think that's what we have to do. The tax credit issue on this thing is part of a comprehensive review, I think, that we need to look at.
Thank you. Our last audience question for you. We're going to, as I said, are going to end early, but there's a question here regarding the role of state government. As I think of this as a positive, we are a growing population in Virginia. And as such, that creates a number of challenges for localities and the state. What's the state role in dealing with the growing population that may include some illegal immigrants, as well as how that impacts our business, which is the rental market and the housing sales market? What's the state's role in that as opposed to the federal government's role? And that first question will go to Senator Deeds.
Is under the federal constitution, we have no foreign policy. We're totally preempted. No matter what a politician will tell you, we are preempted in our ability to enforce immigration laws. That's a federal responsibility. My sense is we have to be as welcoming as possible. The reality is the American economy has been stronger over the course of our history when our immigration policies allow people to come to this country legally. We allow robust immigration, and Virginia, I think, is stronger because we are so diverse. I remember 20 years ago, I was on the Senate Agriculture Committee, and we were having a retreat at Fairy Stone State Park, which is down in Patrick County, and I was driving along Route 58, and I saw a familiar Coca-Cola sign, with the white and red sign hanging in front of a store, and the closer I got to it, the more I realized I couldn't understand what it said because it was in Spanish, because in Patrick County, Virginia, we have become so reliant on workers, on immigrants. We have to be a welcoming community, and that our laws have to reflect that, I think. But to a large extent, American or Virginia law is cut out of this process. We're preempted by the federal Constitution.
Delegate Hudson?
Yeah, I think my short answer as a student of the Constitution would be the state's role is very limited.
That is a short answer. Delegate Runion?
I concur.
He wins, shortest. I want to also get to one other question about agriculture. We are a unique locality set. Some of our localities have a high level of agriculture, some have lesser agriculture, and they are facing pressures from residential development to create housing because it's very difficult to have affordable housing if you don't have housing. That being said, starting off with Delegate Runion, where does agriculture fit in the mix for land use in the Commonwealth?
Thank you. I write the question down so that I can go back and review my notes later, because I truly do believe that to be effective, I have to learn, listen to learn. And so one of the things that I've learned, I grew up in the Valley. I grew up on a poultry farm. My parents were just middle-class farmers. Daddy sold insurance off the farm. So we were kind of the traditional farmer in rural Virginia in that era, and worked for a large poultry company when I got out of school, and in the Harrisonburg area. And so I know a fair amount about production agriculture, particularly from the poultry side, cattle and dairy. Rockingham is the largest dairy producer in the Commonwealth. Augusta's the second, and Rockingham has 10 times more farms than Augusta does. So that's the magnitude of difference. In the 1950s or 60s, Loudoun County was the largest dairy producer in the Commonwealth. They have one dairy farm left. Okay, so significant change, and we understand that. Your question of, oh, and then come over here to Albemarle. I've learned to know a number of folks in Western Albemarle that are farmers, and they make their living from farming. I learned to meet a number of large landowners that that land is then rented to. So it's completely different models in the three localities in agriculture. Then throw in agritourism. And so I'm surprised y'all haven't asked about that question yet as well. That's got to be a hot button topic, at least over here. But so you've had this fundamental change. In Western Rockingham, there's a produce auction that I think they sell twice a week. They're getting ready to do a multi-million-dollar expansion. They've been around about 15 years or so. They're getting ready to do a multi-million-dollar expansion because of the demand for farm-to-table type produce. And it has converted many of our small dairy farms that were no longer economically viable, given the production costs and the ownership costs in the valley, to vegetable production. And then, some of them morphed into the roadside stand, and there's some pretty sophisticated ones out there, but they've been able to generate high revenue per acre, and then they can support their families and continue an economically viable farm. All that being said, I think what you recognize is that agriculture, the face of agriculture, continues to change. And it will change, and it'll be responsive to both local, state, and national regulatory environments, as well as trends, as well as the economy. Who would have guessed that 20 years ago, folks would be paying the price that they're paying for organic chicken or organic eggs, right? And so those things are reflective of where we are today. The land use policies that local governments develop have to be understood. You need to have conversations. When I first started coming over here, the rain tax in Albemarle was the big deal for the Farm Bureau. And to be frank, I was amazed when I understood that the local government wanted to impose a stormwater tax fee on the hay bales, that were the big round hay bales that had plastic wrap on them in the field, because they said it was impervious. And I guess they are, but man, that seemed like an awful lot of overreach to me. Okay. And there's a great example of, if you're sitting here and you're trying to transition your family farm to the next generation, are you really going to say, I've got a regulatory environment that's not supportive of me? Do I just sell out and move somewhere else? We now have Amish in Western Highland County because they couldn't afford to live where they used to live and be productive. And so those are some of the land use issues that you guys have to do. Now, we all got to have a place to live. And we've talked about affordable housing. And so, all those things need to be together, but it is that we've got to have that conversation. Sorry to take so much time. I see Senator squirming there. So
The senator's on his way to a phone call in 6 minutes, so I will thank you, Senator Deeth, for being here. We're gonna we're gonna have Delegate Hudson respond to this, and then we'll have a closing and we'll be done early.
I'm going to duck out too. I think that what the important pieces that I would highlight from that is that we have production agriculture, we have conservation agriculture, which is maybe not generating revenue, but is protecting land in important ways. And then we've got agritourism, which is a little bit of both. They all deserve to be in the mix, and that we should be having conversations as a community about how we value all of those important natural resources. So that's ditto.
Well, please join me in thanking our delegation for being here. Please grab a coffee on your way out.